real life monsters, if you will. Legends come to life. So what I'll try to do is just kind of roll through it all, talk about everything, and then hopefully there's plenty of time so we can come back and then you could ask specific questions about, you know, any of this, any certain creature or whatever, and I can always elaborate on that more in depth. So how many folks have seen me here at this library before? I see familiar faces. Thanks for coming back.
You don't need it?
You don't need it. They shut
Okay.
mine.
Cool.
Seriously? So yeah, I really appreciate it. This is my third time to come here to, this is my local library, which people are often surprised to hear because they think I live in Falk, Arkansas or some exotic locale, but I do live here in Bedford, Texas, and I grew up here. I lived in Euless with my parents. My parents are here tonight. In front of them here. They're very proud of me. I wrote a few books and managed to turn monsters into something of a vocation. So, you know, it took a while, but I did it. I've been studying these creatures since I was young, in one form or fashion, and probably like most of you, started with some books, saw something on TV when you were young, and sparked a fascination that may have lasted a lifetime, or like in my case, sort of overtook my entire life. So everything I've ever done sort of had a connection to monsters or something like that. So by writing books and things like that, it made me quote-unquote an expert. There really are no experts in this. That's the thing, you know. A lot of times I'll be in the newspaper, let's say Bigfoot expert, you know, if you're like, what makes him an expert? Well, nothing. I didn't say I was an expert. That's what the paper said, not myself, because all of this is obviously conjecture, because without absolute proof, you can't be an expert. But here's a few of my books. For those that know me and follow my books, I've written 4 books. I've been involved in some films lately, a lot of documentary films by a company called Small Town Monsters out of Ohio. And they first approached me when they were doing a documentary on the Boggy Creek Monster, and obviously I'd written a book and have a connection to that, so it made sense to have me involved with that film. And following that, I kind of had a working relationship. I did the narration for Boggy Creek Monster, and I continue to narrate many of their films and work with them. So that's been an exciting thing because it provides some visuals and kind of brings more members to the team. And the way these documentaries are done is very much the way I write the books. It's just telling you the facts, listening to witnesses, and looking at all the evidence that may be out there and letting you draw your own conclusions. You know, not trying to make you believe or persuade you. Again, everybody here can make up their own mind as to what they believe about these creatures. So that's been the cool thing about being involved in these documentaries, because like my book, you can bring out the whole story and let people decide. I've also been on several TV shows. Monsters and Mysteries in America was on sporadically. I worked as a story producer for the show. You may have seen me on Finding Bigfoot a couple of times. I was the small guy. Here's Bobo, you know. Here's Bobo, here's Cliff, here's me. That was a fun experience, you know, and that was the great thing. I always thought, wow, when you write a book, what do you do now? You know, how do you promote this? Well, I wrote The Beast of Boggy Creek, which was my first book. I just wrote it because I wanted to. I've been a musician for years and years, and on the side I always worked as a writer in one capacity or another, and I always wanted to write my own book. And so I kind of put things on hold and thought, what would I want to write? What is my favorite subject? You know, what do you write a book about? The great American novel. You know, you sit down. It was the best of times. It was the end of times, the end. I didn't know, but I thought, you know, my favorite thing is The Legend of Boggy Creek, because I had seen this movie when I was young. And I always wondered what was real about it. And I thought, well, that would be a perfect thing to do. I could, you know, discover what was real about this, what was true, what actually happened, what inspired this old movie, because it was based on sightings of allegedly real Sasquatch-like creatures in Arkansas. So that became the book, and I just did it almost literally because I wanted to know. Well, the book came out, and within a short period of time, television producers started calling and said, would you like to be on Monsters and Mysteries in America? We're doing the Fountain Monster, and since you wrote a book on it, we could use your expertise. I thought, wow, this is great, you know, so that helped. And then Finding Bigfoot came along, and I'm on Finding Bigfoot, and right there on Animal Planet, my book cover comes up, you know. I thought, okay, we're off to a good start here. So that's what kind of got me going in this process, and you know, of research and writing. Now, in many ways, I consider myself an investigative journalist, because I'm going out there, I'm looking to the facts, I'm interviewing people, and I'm writing the story. But I'm also more than that. I do go in the field, and I do go out there, because you can't write a book about creatures who live in the wilds of North America if you've never been to the locations. So that's been kind of the fun part about the book, because I've combined my love of outdoors with the journalism. You're outside, you know, you're enjoying nature, and hey, you might have a chance to see something strange or unknown. So that's been part of it, and one thing I enjoy, here's a picture of me. It looks very, you know, jungly, you know, like I'm searching for dinosaurs, but this is actually in Florida, in an area where skunk ape sightings had occurred. So,
What sightings?
What's that?
What kind of sightings?
Skunk ape.
Skunk ape?
Yes, skunk ape. And if you don't know what that is, we're going to get into that more very shortly. Skunk ape, or a Bigfoot-like creature, that's what they call them in Florida. It's humid, it's hot, they're, you know, I guess they're sweatier and smelly. So, yes, so, you know, searching for skunk apes is part of my journalistic pursuits, and it's often very fun. Cryptozoology, how many of y'all know the term cryptozoology? It's often butchered, you know, people call me up to be on, we're producers for a show, we're going to do a show about cryptology, or cryptoids, or, you know, they don't even know the term, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to really sign up for your TV show real quick. So it's a tricky term, but a cryptid is an animal that's a study of cryptozoology. Cryptozoology is defined as the study of unknown animals. So crypto being unknown, and zoology relating to animals. So that's the term. It's, you know, it's basically considered a pseudoscience. I mean, you're not going to go get a degree in cryptozoology. There are none. You could get a, you know, a degree in zoology, biology, things like that, but cryptozoology is not recognized and mostly shunned by any serious scientist, because they certainly don't want to attach their name to what many people consider myths or creatures of fable, you know, and they really don't know the difference. Unicorns, Bigfoot, they just lump it all in one and call it pseudoscience. Fine with me. I'm not a scientist. You know, I'm more of the investigative journalist, but by virtue of that and studying these animals, you do learn a degree of zoology and things like that. So it's kind of something that encompasses a lot of disciplines. Within cryptozoology, you have the cryptids, and some of these you'll probably recognize: Bigfoot, Yeti. There's lake monsters, Loch Ness Monster, everybody knows that one. Lake monsters are spotted in many lakes all across North America, and other lochs in Scotland, all over the world. Flying humanoids. Anybody heard of Mothman? That's a very famous one because it had a movie, The Mothman Prophecies. Reptilian humanoids. Now we're getting kind of off into weird stuff. Lizard men. Those would be considered cryptids. Giant birds, thunderbirds, possibly pterosaurs, relic dinosaurs. any kind of surviving dinosaur, whether that's something that is small or big or something that was supposedly gone extinct millions of years ago, yet people have sightings. So that would be a cryptid. Extinct species, that would be something. Who knows about the Tasmanian tiger, thylacine? That's a very famous one. So, and other strange beasts, one which I will save to the end because it is spooky and this is close to Halloween. But this is what we're going to go over today, sort of the crash course of cryptids. We got to start off with the most famous one, which is Bigfoot. And Bigfoot is big, let me tell you. I've been doing this almost a decade, and I've seen a popularity of Bigfoot like this. And a lot of that is because of the show. It's because Finding Bigfoot has been on and ran about almost 10 seasons. So I saw the debut of that and the impact that Finding Bigfoot had on the popularity of the creature. And obviously there's a lot to Bigfoot because there's a long history of sightings. It's also a creature that is fairly plausible. It seems only natural that possibly one of these creatures exists out there. And sightings date back literally centuries. Now, a lot of people will say, Bigfoot must be old if he's been sighted for that long. And how does he get around so many places? It's a he. That's a misnomer. It's not a singular creature. I mean, if this creature is real, there would have to be a population. There's no one Bigfoot. It is a population of Bigfoots, big feet. However you want to call it, Sasquatches. So it's not one creature, and the sightings are all over the place. Now, of course, the Pacific Northwest is the place where the Bigfoot stories started coming out, and that's the most well-known area associated with the creature. And nowadays with the TV, I think people are understand that there's sightings everywhere. It's Finding Bigfoot went to a different state, so it's become more than just the location of the Pacific Northwest, but that's where it's associated. And then you have regional names. We just talked about the skunk ape. So if you're in Florida and you run across a big, hairy, man-like creature, somebody will say, oh, well, you saw a skunk ape. Well, that's not a Florida accent. I don't know what a Florida accent is. I only do one accent, that's Texan. But that would be the terminology. And you have, Sasquatch, which is a conglomeration of terms. It was sort of a fictional, made-up term to represent the creature. Sasquatch, people cite that as a Native American name, but it isn't exactly. Someone made that up for convenience, but that's kind of the term you get, more of a Native American angle of Sasquatch. People call them swamp apes, wild men. A lot of old newspapers carried stories about creatures that fit the description of Bigfoot, but back in those days there was no term Bigfoot. They called them wild men. Kentucky has the grass man. Sounds cool. Of course, you've got the even more regional names, the Boggy Creek Monster, and that's southern Arkansas, and that's just simply a term derived from the location where Boggy Creek is, and there's a monster. They didn't know what to call it. They didn't know the term Bigfoot, so it just became called the Boggy Creek Monster. There's hundreds of other great names: Noxie Monster, Momo the Missouri Monster. Some of my favorites, like the Fairvilla Gorilla, super creative. The journalist, the newspaper report, some lady saw this huge creature in the woods, near Fairvilla. Well, it's kind of like a gorilla, the Fairvilla Gorilla, and there's the newspaper articles. Those are really cool to look at, and sort of things that you can find. You search the term Bigfoot, it may not come up because they're not calling it a Bigfoot. They're calling it a gorilla-like creature. So you really have to sift through newspapers a lot of times to find these reports. The Sabine thing, that's another one. Sabine River out in East Texas. If you've been across the border of Louisiana, you may have gone across the Sabine River. You may have zoomed right past the Sabine thing. International names, of course. These creatures are seen everywhere, in other countries even. Bahamas from Russia, Hibagon, Japan. Japan even has a Bigfoot-like creature. The Mapiguari, Brazil, Yeren, China, Yeti. We've all heard of Yeti. We'll talk about that. It's kind of the most famous. Even Australia, the Yowie. Yowie. That sounds great on the Bobby. So what you have is just an enormous number of legends, sightings, history for creatures all over the world that resemble Bigfoot. And so you could probably spend a lifetime studying that stuff. All the legends, all the sightings, all the history that encompass this. And in my mind, some are more credible than others. I mean, sightings of the Yeren in China, there is some really compelling evidence. And the location of that is in a government forest where people just can't walk freely. So a lot of that is sort of sanctioned off, and the sightings are infrequent. But if you go there and talk to the locals, they will tell you about the Yeren, and they will come up with footprints and a lot of other compelling evidence to suggest that perhaps there is something roaming those mountains over there in China. But Bigfoot, theories. We'll look at some of the theories as we discuss these creatures, and that's, of course, when you start thinking about this as an adult, what you want to look at. When you're a kid, it's just Bigfoot. It is. It just exists. You saw it on television. But as you get to be an adult, you're thinking, okay, well, how can I reconcile that? How in the world could a 7-foot-tall, man-like creature be roaming around throughout most of the states of North America, yet we don't have any solid proof? And that's where you're just going to start running through these theories. The first one, obviously, is that an unknown, undiscovered ape of some sort. People describe it as man-like, yet it has a lot of ape characteristics. Humanoid, long arms, it's covered in fur or hair, scraggly hair, it's dark and brown, things like that naturally seem ape-like. You even have some reports that say the creature not only walks upright on 2 legs, but it can also move on all 4s. And those are some of the spookiest sightings. When I've talked to witnesses who say the thing ran up on all 4s and then stood up and walked. And it was close enough for them to determine this wasn't a bear. It was some sort of a man-like ape. And those are spooky because a lot of times you kind of think of Bigfoot as this lumbering, hey, how's it going? Just cruising through the forest, no big deal. Okay, you kind of have this pop culture image of it. It's friendly, it's fuzzy, it's Harry and the Hendersons. Like a lot of people go, oh yeah, oh, you write Bigfoot books? Oh, I love Harry and the Hendersons, man, it's great. And that may be the reality of Bigfoot, I don't know, but there is a lot of sightings that are much more frightening than that. Because in actuality, if you were a hunter, for example, and you're walking out in the woods alone, and you were to come up on a 7-foot-tall animal that looks at you with human-like eyes, I don't care what kind of gun you're carrying, I don't care what kind of compound bow you have, this is going to be frightening. And for some witnesses, whom I've even talked to, it's life-changing. It changes what your whole perception about this stuff is. So, that's the reality of it. If it is some sort of an ape, it does have man-like qualities. It would be a very frightening experience. And a lot of people say, well, there's been a lot of sightings by hunters. Well, how come one of them hasn't shot one? Well, most everyone that I've either interviewed or read about, they all say the same thing. I saw it, I looked at it, I wasn't quite sure it wasn't a man, or it looked too human. I just couldn't take the chance of shooting that thing. If it was a hoax, it would be murder. Even worse, what if I didn't knock it down? You know, what if the buckshot didn't drop this thing? What would it then do to me? So in every circumstance, no matter how brave this hunter is, it's a coon hunter who can go out in the dark swamps at night, doesn't matter. You come up on this thing, it looks too man-like. You're just not going to shoot it. Now some of the other theories, you know, could this be like a relic hominid? This would be like a relic species of human, like a Neanderthal. Something like that. Something that somehow had survived extinction, or what we believe to be extinct. You know, there's a lot of science that comes out every day about the development of us as a species, the great apes as a species. And that, as they say, that tree is very bushy. There's many aspects to that. And many of these creatures or humanoids that have allegedly gone extinct do fit the description of Bigfoot. So that's something that people consider that would explain this. So not so much of an ape or a great ape, as in, you know, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, but something more close to human. Or is it something else? The longer it goes without proof, the more you get wild theories, such as maybe it's an interdimensional creature, some sort of supernatural thing. You know, people think in terms of that simply, I think, because they're trying to explain this. On one hand, you have credible people who've had sightings, yet you still don't have that proof. So it creates a lot of wild controversy and arguments over what the creature is. And to me, it's okay to bring all these theories forth because it's something hard to explain. But for me, I kind of keep it as, I believe it's some kind of biological creature. If it does exist, animals can do amazing things. They really can. We underestimate what they can do. People say, well, how come there's no bones? How many people have taken a walk in the woods? Have you ever run across a bear carcass? A dead bear? Dead bones? That's a comparison. And recently, we were discussing some of the aspects of the population of Bigfoot. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Jeff Meldrum, you've probably seen him on some shows, he did some amazing extrapolations based on Bigfoot sightings and the numbers which would take to keep this population alive. So take for example Washington State. There's an estimated 25,000, 30,000 bears out there. By estimations, and this is based on sightings, just a guess, there might be 250, maybe 300 Bigfoot there. 30,000 bear, 300 Bigfoot in one state. Rarely, if ever, do you come across the bones of a dead bear. There's 30,000 of them in the state. So what do you think the chances are of finding the bones of a Bigfoot when there's only 250 and in a whole entire state? Very, very minuscule. So if you look at it in those perspectives, thinking about what would be a realistic population of these creatures, which could be very low. I mean, there's endangered animals that are very low populations, below 500. Bigfoot obviously would have to have a low population because there would be more sightings. So if you think about it in those terms, it doesn't seem that far-fetched that we haven't found any bones. People say, well, there's no evidence of that. Well, there is evidence. Not conclusive evidence, but there is intriguing evidence, such as footprints. There's a lot of footprints. I've got a couple back there on my table you can check out at the end of this. There's one from Washington State. There's even one from the infamous Patterson-Gimlin film. There's obviously photos and things like that. A lot of these are blurry. The exemplary ones we call blob squatches. You can see why. There's a lot of photos of the woods and foliage in which people have circled a whole bunch of shadows saying they're Bigfoots. Maybe they are, but that's not helping anything because that doesn't help raise the bar for what we're presenting as evidence. But the picture of this track right here, this is known as the Elkins Creek track. It was taken in Georgia. There's evidence of dermal ridges, which would be the equivalent of fingerprints in this cast. And some of those have been analyzed by not just Bigfoot researchers, but people at universities, by Jimmy Chilcutt, who's an FBI fingerprint expert, who agreed that there's some kind of fingerprints here, and it does look like a legitimate track. So there are pieces of evidence that are compelling in the Bigfoot case. We all know the Patterson-Gimlin film, the most famous image of Bigfoot. There's still controversy about that. Nobody's ever been able to prove it or disprove it. You've got guys come forward and say, I was in the suit. They don't have the suit. You've got the other parties. I'm good friends with Bob Gimlin, the other half of this film crew, who maintains that they saw a real creature that day they filmed it. And again, I have a footprint cast back there of this creature they call Patty back there if you want to check it out. So, this remains today one of the best and most famous images of Bigfoot, and probably one of the most recognizable pieces of footage ever in history, ever, right here. It still remains unknown whether that's a real creature. Before Bigfoot, there was the Yeti. If you were young, reading books, back in my day, I bought some book called Strange But True from the Scholastic Readers. You could buy them in school. The first creature in there was the Yeti. So I knew about that. It was something that was known longer than Bigfoot. Bigfoot was coined in about 1958. The Yeti went back further than that. And for those that associate the Yeti with the snowy areas, that's correct because it's in the Himalayan mountain regions of India, Nepal, and Tibet. These are very remote places. High mountains. This is in the area of Mount Everest. A lot of people have this image of the Yeti being white. How many people kind of think of the Yeti and think white? That's a pop culture thing. Because movies always have the Yeti as white. And it seems cool because it's a snowy environment. But actually, the people who cited the creature never said it was white. It was always described as brown, more ape-like or bear-like. It's like something like this. But it goes back many, many years. 1899 is when British explorers first discovered some strange prints in Tibet. And when they talked to the Sherpa guides, they said, what kind of animal is this? And they began to describe this ape-like creature, the Yeti. And that's when the Westerners first became acquainted with this term. And it wasn't until 1921 some more explorers found some tracks, and the Sherpas described it as being a man-bear snowman, and a reporter mistranslated that to abominable snowman. So that's where he got the term. So it wasn't even what they called it over there. But once you get a name, apparently it sticks, because the Yeti is the abominable snowman. You've all seen the Rudolph Christmas special with Bumble, that kind of perpetuates that white Yeti thing. But there's been a lot of credible evidence for this as far as the footprints, the sightings. You've got one of the most famous ones in 1951. If you've seen the Yeti footprint, Eric Shipton discovered a line of mysterious tracks. And you see that referenced a lot when you see the history of the Yeti. So this dates back into the 1950s, in which they organized some very serious expeditions out there. There was, in fact, a millionaire by the name of Tom Slick, who lived in Texas, put a lot of money into this, and he sent guys like Peter Byrne over there in the Himalayas to search for the Yeti. And they pretty much felt that any day now somebody was going to bring in proof of this. You know, this was only 50 years after the mountain gorillas were discovered. I mean, we were still discovering big species, big mammals. You know, the mountain gorilla was the same thing. People said, yeah, there's these huge, you know, apes that live up in the mountains. People are like, we know all the apes. We're not buying it. No, seriously. Well, finally the guy went up there and shot one and brought it down and says, is this good enough for you? And that's what it took to prove that. So, you know, you still had that same kind of mentality going on in the 1950s in which they thought, well, hey, we've got some other kind of an ape roaming up there in those high altitudes in the snow. Let's put some money in this, you know? And that's exactly what they did. But unfortunately, you know, they didn't come home with the smoking gun, so to speak. They weren't able to prove it. And ever since then, you know, this is something that has continued. Some groups and some explorers have gone over there. It's much more difficult to do, though. Now, I've never been to Nepal. I'm not a snow guy. Okay, let's just get that. I was once, my agent once was looking at somebody to do a show in Alaska. And I'm like, no, I don't think that's me. I'm more of a swampy southern guy. I will freeze to death. But my colleague Ken Gerhard took that show, and it was called Missing in Alaska, and he did one season. He did well. He didn't freeze to death. He did break his ankle, unfortunately. So that was not good. But anyway, so I'm not, you know, the Yeti was never something that I was set out to go explore. So it's just much harder because the higher elevations, it takes some serious exploration over there. So over the years, you've had a lot of these mountain climbers who have reported sightings of the Yeti. And obviously, you know, theories that it was some sort of an ape. Now apes, you know, are typically live in tropical environments. They're not going to live at those altitudes, so it kind of was a conundrum, and nobody could quite make sense of it. But essentially, what people were describing resembled an ape. Also, a good theory was that it was a species of bear, and that made a little more sense with the snow climates, the environment. You know, it was described as being brown. And there's been some recent DNA studies done over there. Brian Sykes and taken some samples of hair and things like that. And you know, there's still some debate over the results of those, but they could point to the creature being like an archaic bear, even a hybrid of something. So even if it's unexpected, even if it's a hybrid or something unique, it is still something that would provide proof that there is a Yeti. Maybe it's not an ape, it's not a bumble, but it still could be an unknown animal. So these things are still in study, and it's much harder to figure out. Some of the sightings, you know, thought, or some of the witnesses thought that it could be feral humans. That was another thing. You know, the sightings were at a distance. It was walking upright. You know, it could have been covered in fur, and some of the explanations given were that it could be a feral human. But that's another thing that would be hard, because this environment is not conducive to kind of running wild and naked through the snow. So. Here's the other big guy, the Loch Ness Monster. Everybody knows the Loch Ness Monster. And when a lot of people, you know, oh, do you research creatures like Bigfoot? Loch Ness Monster, that's usually number 2 that they ask me. Like, well, not so much. Scotland's far away, and I don't need to go to Scotland because there's lake monsters in other places. But the Loch Ness Monster is so famous because it's been with us for so long. I mean, sightings do date back to the 6th century. That's the first rumored sighting, which an Irish monk, Saint Columba, encountered a strange aquatic beast. And this was on record, and this was in the very loch where later on people would report sightings. It really came to the public's attention in 1933. That's when a rash of sightings there on the loch made the newspapers. And that's when sort of, you know, the image of this sort of plesiosaur, of a dinosaur-type creature came to mind, and that's really what brought the fascination. In 1934, you had what was called the surgeon's photo, printed in the newspaper. And this stuff was printed in every newspaper all over the world and would be picked up by the press and run in other papers. So it made the Loch Ness Monster super famous. Everybody's probably seen this famous photo. Now that's called the surgeon's photo, and unfortunately, in recent times, has been proven to be a hoax. So the picture still remains as sort of our image of Nessie, but that particular photo was a hoax. But that didn't, that didn't wash away all the witness sightings. You had a lot of credible witnesses, people who lived on the loch, that knew those waters and were there on a daily basis that reported credible sightings. And of course, since 1934, there's been, literally probably thousands of sightings reported in Loch Ness. A lot of attention was paid to Loch Ness by scientists, especially back in the 1970s. A lot of the early shows would fund and research and, television shows in which they went out there and did sonar analysis of the waters, things like that, took boats out. And so there's been a lot of actual scientific research. I think in a lot of ways, the Loch Ness Monster was another one that was kind of plausible. It's like Bigfoot. Okay, there could be an ape we don't know. There could be some sort of a creature living in those waters, because there have been sightings of sea serpents in the seas many, many years. We don't know what's in the seas. We're just beginning to understand. You've got the giant squid. It wasn't only a decade or two ago when they actually learned that this creature was real. It wasn't videotaped until recently on film. So, the waters are something that sort of obscured and hid the possibilities that lurk below. So I think scientists looked at that as, the possibility of the Loch Ness Monster was worth scientific study. So, along the thinking was a surviving dinosaur, a plesiosaur, and that was always the most famous thing. And when I was a kid, I was like, wow, a plesiosaur, a dinosaur. You'd seen the pictures, to think that there was one that still lived in this creepy dark loch, that was cool. Others try to explain it as otters, seals, or even giant eels that were moving on the water that would be sighted in just such a way. Even logs, waves, or seismic gas, almost things that were moving as logs would sink. They would lose the air and go back to the surface and pop up. That could explain the sightings of Loch Ness, or even an optical illusion. Because when you're just staring at that loch, you see the waves and you see things, and it almost looks like things are moving across that surface. So those were a lot of the explanations. And in recent years, obviously the technology has caught up. They've done sonar scans of the entire lake. They can even do things now like take a sample of that water and run it to look for all the DNA that's been deposited in that water. So we're pretty close to sort of ruling in or ruling out something unknown in those waters. But even if Loch Ness doesn't hold a creature, maybe one of these other lakes does. And that's one thing people probably don't know much about, that really most North American lakes up in the north have legends of some sort of lake monster. Champ is probably the most famous. How many of y'all have heard of Champ? Yeah, see, this is another famous one, and it has sightings that date back many, many years, and a lot of newspapers ran that. It was sort of America's Loch Ness Monster. So that was one of the most famous of these. Ogopogo, British Columbia, the Canadians need a monster. Ogopogo. Lake Tahoe, Tahoe-Tessie, and they were always generally named after Nessie. You've got Nessie, you've got Tahoe-Tessie, you have Bessie. There's all sorts of derivatives off that. Even in Scotland, though, there's one called the Morag. There's a great book on this one. It's another loch that's not famous. Nobody knows about the Morag. Morag sounds kind of like the more like sinister cousin of the Loch Ness Monster. It's a fascinating book because you're reading this and it's got a lot of credible sightings and a long history as well in this other loch. And there's Bo Nessie from England. So there's a lot of these lake monsters, and many of them haven't been explored or taken as seriously as the Loch Ness Monster, and certainly aren't as famous, but they all have some great history. And you know, if you're ever on vacation and you're near one of the lakes, especially up north, just ask some of the locals. I guarantee you, they got sightings of some sort of a creature. Here's another favorite, Chupacabra. We live in Texas, so this is a hot topic here all the time. The thing is, and when people ask me,
Hey, you ever study the Chupacabra?
I have to ask them, which one are you talking about? And they're like, what do you mean, which one? The Chupacabra. Well, there's actually two different versions of the Chupacabra. The first one, and the one I knew of first, and the one I find more fascinating, were sightings in Puerto Rico. And these sort of came to the media in 1995 when people there in those small towns began reporting unexplained deaths of their livestock. They would go out, there'd be 40 sheep dead, killed by something, and they were apparently drained of their blood. Whatever this thing was gruesome. And then suddenly, a witness reported seeing a small bipedal-like creature, something like this. It had spikes going down its back. It had big eyes. It could walk on two legs, but it was small, 3 or 4 feet tall. And they saw it near their home in Puerto Rico, and it ran off into the bushes. Now, when this got in the paper, combined with this alleged blood-sucking trait, they called it El Chupacabra, which translates to the goat sucker in Spanish. So from then on, in the Latin America countries, there were sightings of creatures like this, and it was known as Chupacabra. There were some in Venezuela, in Chile, places like that. And so this was knowledge. These locals knew of this creature. It was something totally different than what a lot of people think of as Chupacabra now. What happened was, in the 2000s, people started seeing some four-legged canids here in Texas. They were hairless, they looked weird, they had pointy ears and protruding teeth. Somebody in the media called it a Chupacabra. And therein lies the confusion. Because now we have a four-legged, obviously a dog-looking thing, a canid, which are calling Chupacabra. So that's not what, in my mind, was, the Chupacabra, my beloved Chupacabra, that scary creature from Puerto Rico. So I'm sure how many people have seen the dash cam Chupacabra running in front of the cop car, I mean, on a daily basis, I get pictures of hairless raccoons and things telling me it's Chupacabra. The thing is, though, there's something to that. There really is, because some of these creatures, we actually have carcasses of some of the creatures that were seen in Texas. Some ranchers have either shot them or found deceased animals on the roadside and taken them in and had a look at them. And they come up a lot of times with mysterious circumstances. They have strange things on their body, things that would not normally be on a coyote or a wolf. They're larger or they're smaller. There's a taxidermy one in Blanco, Texas, which has it's just a very strange looking animal. And when they do DNA on this, they do find that it's a coyote or a wolf or something like that, who's stricken with sarcoptic mange, which makes them hairless. So others have found that they could be a mix between a rare red wolf or a Mexican wolf or something like that. You may even have a hybrid. So while it may not be a monster, so to speak, this could be something that is unique. It could be a hybrid tainted of some sort, which would classify it as a cryptid. So the case is still out on what these four-legged mangy things are. They're not simply mangy coyotes. They're not mangy raccoons, let me tell you that. But some of the other theories, obviously, especially in the case of Latin America, was that they were extraterrestrial. You know, they kind of had, you know, the big eyes, kind of had that gray alien look. A lot of people, you know, thought that. I often hear something come into like the government had experimented on animals and let them loose in Puerto Rico. You know, like, that's another theory. And it seems like with a lot of these cryptids, you often get that, you know, government involvement, whether it's you know, covering up Bigfoot. They know about it, but they're not going to tell us, or they're experimenting on creatures. And naturally, we all know when the government is involved in some sort of science, they can't even fill a pothole. The animal is going to get loose, and it is going to run to the woods and run amok. So, you know, I suppose if they were experimenting on animals and created something that looked like this, it would have the potential to get out. So, you know, we can't discount that theory. Mothman. How many of y'all have heard of Mothman? Mothman has become ever popular, and it's been one of the most famous cryptids out there because of its association with movies. Now, the Mothman is considered a flying humanoid. There's categories of type of cryptids because there's never just one of any sort. You got sightings of all sorts of creatures all over. But it would be known as a flying humanoid because it was described as being roughly human-like, yet had large wings. It had huge red eyes. And it was first seen in November of 1966. It made headlines when two couples were in a Lover's Lane area outside Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Now, this wasn't just any sort of backwoods Lover's Lane parking area. It had also been the site of a government facility and a munitions storage. They had bunkers out there. It's kind of a creepy place. And these couples were out there that night, sitting in their car, doing, you know, talking. What they were doing. And suddenly, their attention was drawn over here by something that moved. And they saw it, and it flew up. It rose up. It had huge wings. It looked like a human with wings. And of course, it scared them to death. They started up the cars. They started driving away. And whatever this is, pursued the cars. Later on, this story got out, got in the newspapers, became big, big news. Shortly thereafter, other people began to see the same creature, reporting sightings of the Mothman. It was a big thing. And Point Pleasant, West Virginia is a small town, very small town. This was plastered all over the news. You had some of the local news reporters who started covering this, to the point where they were having to write about it weekly. It was such a big deal. There were so many sightings. Then there were sightings of UFOs. Then there was men in black that showed up in their little town. For 13 months, there was all sorts of strange reports here in and around Point Pleasant, which is located along the Ohio River on the western portion of West Virginia. All sorts of strange reports. And this all culminated with a tragedy that happened there in December of 1967. There's a bridge that spans that Ohio River that goes from the little town of Point Pleasant over to Gallipolis. I never say it right. Ohio. And the bridge collapsed at rush hour, killing 46 people. Plunged into the icy Ohio River in December. And so the Mothman, at that point, obviously, nobody wanted to hear about the Mothman anymore. It just went away. And over the years, it was something that sort of built up. John Keel, which was a writer who wrote about paranormal subjects, he wrote a book called The Mothman Prophecies, right here. And when that came out, they brought a lot of attention to this. All the sightings of the creature, the UFO, the men in black, all the things that happened there before that tragic bridge incident. Years later, they actually made a Hollywood movie. How many folks have seen the Mothman Prophecies with Richard Gere? It's a pretty cool movie. It actually is. It's a good movie, though the Mothman is sort of in the background. They just sort of base it on the story and kind of take a lot of liberties. But the thing is, it helped to make the Mothman much more famous. And over the years, there continued to be sightings. They were sporadic in the area. The Mothman sort of figure. But it was something that pretty much was confined in that late 60s, in that one time period, especially in those 13 months after it was first sighted by the couples up to the bridge collapse. It was something that became more famous and more famous as it went. And of course, like other cryptids, everybody has to theorize about what it is. Some people dismissed it, it's an out-of-place bird, an owl. It had big eyes, it flew. Owls are pretty big. If you've ever seen one, their wingspan is huge. So that was naturally something people considered if it wasn't some sort of an otherworldly being or an unknown animal. But I mean, there are no biological comparisons to sort of a bipedal humanoid with giant wings. You'd have to have huge wings to pick up that much weight to fly. You also had the government thing there. Because this was the TNT area, and I've been up there, they have these bunkers that were built into the side of a hill. And the purpose was just so they could store ammunition there for World War II, and you could not see it. If you flew over, you saw nothing. But if you were down on the level, you could open these doors and go in. There are these big domed buildings where they stored the ammo. And they're really creepy. There's a bunch of them dotting in those hills over there. And there's a TNT factory. And there's silos and factories and fire coming out of these big chimneys. It's just a spooky place. So you can almost see how this would inspire people to theorize that the government was involved in this. I remember seeing somebody decided it was paratroopers, and that's what people had seen in the case of the Mothman. But if you listen to the witnesses and read the old newspapers, it was certainly something far different than a person, a paratrooper, that just simply couldn't explain it. Now, I'd say Mothman has probably become as famous as Bigfoot in many ways because there's a lot of these Bigfoot conferences, there's festivals, there's a Mothman festival that occurs each year in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. It's a very small town. This festival draws 12,000 people. 12,000 people. Now first, the local, the city council at Point Pleasant is like, you want to have a what? A Mothman festival? Dumb. Mothman ain't real. Or whatever their conclusion was. But there's some guys there, Jeff Walmsley, who runs a very cool Mothman museum. He thought this was a great idea, and interest had built, especially they made the Hollywood movie. Everybody wanted to know about the Mothman. So, fast forward to just last month when myself and some of my colleagues, Nick Redford back there, we were at the Mothman Festival. There was 12,000 people in those streets. And now the town council's like, what can we do to help? This is great. So it's cryptid tourism. I mean, these things, whether they're real or not, they're drawing in tourists. They're bringing tax dollars. And so I think a lot of people have seen this. You've got so many Bigfoot conferences now that have popped up. Every little town out there wants to have a Bigfoot conference because they've seen things like this that draw people's interest. They're interested in it. And again, you don't have to endorse it or say it's, you don't have to, believe it personally. You just have to say, hey, it's possible. This is a possibility. And you can't deny the fact that the Mothman was seen there, and it has a history. So you can see, and I'll put the slide up here because you see this statue. I mean, this is a really cool statue. And all day long at that festival, the statue has a much longer line than I do at my table. Trust me. Seriously, there is just a line of people all day long taking pictures with that statue. And that just shows you the level of interest that these things have gained over the years. Okay, now we're going to start getting into some more weird stuff, okay? Are you with me? You're still with me?
Yes, sir.
All right. Lizard man, lizard men, reptilian humanoids. Sightings of these creatures have been reported over the years in North America and other places. There's not as many of them, but they still are reported. And they're described as sort of anthropomorphic, which is human-like creatures with scaly, greenish or brownish skin. They're often said to have three-toed feet, according to the footprints, and they can walk upright. So we're talking about sort of a creature that's alien-like, reptilian-like, not something with a long crocodile nose. I mean, the newspaper will put it in there as something silly, but it's more something like this. And the most famous of these is the Bishopville lizard man, and one that I'm quite acquainted with myself. But there's been many others. The Thetis lake monster is another in British Columbia. You've got gator men, of course, in Florida. You've got to have something to go with the skunk apes, right? One of my personal favorites, the Loveland frog. He's located in Ohio. Ohio's got some weird stuff. The more I look at Ohio, the more I've gone there, there's just some really weird stuff. So this was sort of a bipedal frog-like, more of an amphibian, but it kind of relates to this whole reptilian lizard man thing. The Bishopville lizard man case is super interesting because in this case you had a lot of police involvement. And this case dates back to 1988, and the most sensational sighting was reported by a young man who lived there in Bishopville, South Carolina. And Bishopville is a small town. It's located near this area called Skapor Swamp. It's a spooky swamp, of course. And one night, very late at night, he got off work in Bishopville, and to drive home he had to pass through Skapor Swamp. Well, as fate would have it, he had a flat tire. So he was, he's miles from home. He can't walk. There's no homes out there. There's nothing to do. Go ahead and just change it so he could get home. So he finished changing the tire, and he put the jack back in the trunk, closed it up. And about that time, he turns around, and there was enough moonlight to where he could see something coming across this field, coming at him. And at first, he thought it was a person, which is creepy enough, all right? But as it got closer, you could see this wasn't a person. It appeared to be greenish or brown. It looked scaly. It was walking upright. It had 3 long fingers, and it was coming right at him. So of course he jumped in the car, started it up, and whatever this thing was, literally jumped on the car, was trying to reach inside and grab it. And he starts it up, and he peels out, and he manages to get down the road, and just the thing falls off. He gets up, and it's still chasing him. It jumps back on the car, and again he loses it, and he finally zooms off and leaves this thing to dust. To make a long story short, a week before, the police had gotten a report of a car that had been vandalized, which appeared to be vandalized by an animal of some sort. And this was located right there on Skapor Swamp. And so when that story made the newspaper, this young man and his father came forward and said, well, we may have something here that relates to that. And they proceeded to say that people in the area had seen this creature. They were calling it the lizard man. And Christopher Davis told the sheriff there, Sheriff Liston Truesdale, about this encounter. And it was something that, of course, immediately made headlines as soon as the news got word of this, and it became famous. Other people came forward with sightings, and there was sightings following that. So for about 2 or 3 years there, everybody was reporting sightings of the lizard man. And the police in most cases of these cryptids, you're just simply not going to pay any attention to this. They're not going to take any Bigfoot sighting seriously, and sure as heck aren't going to come in and take a report of a lizard man. But in this case, the sheriff felt it was his duty to take these reports. He felt he wasn't convinced there was a lizard man, so to speak, but if it was something out there, especially if it was attacking people, if he did look into it and something happened or somebody got killed, then people would be pointing fingers at him that he didn't do anything. So he had the wherewithal to actually take these witnesses, and in one case it was a family of 5 that saw this creature. He would separate them and have them write down everything they saw. And so unlike a lot of these cryptid cases, you can go, and I went to this town and I visited with the sheriff. He gave me access to all these police reports. I had the affidavits, literally, what these people had seen written down when they saw it in 1988. Not me interviewing them, 30 years later, but at the time. So that was very cool. And so you had this sort of a police investigation. It was almost like a movie. Seriously, I mean, you can't make this thing, you can't make these things up. And again, the town wasn't, convinced it was a lizard man, but they've since also decided they needed to have a lizard man festival. You got the Mothman festival. So over the years, they've recognized, it's local culture. I went down there and I wrote a book on the lizard man, and when I went down to this festival as a special guest, I was on one of the major television networks, up in the studio, sitting on a couch with the reporter, and he's asking me questions about the lizard man. And I was kind of sitting there in my mind going, this is nuts. How did this happen? I come to the town in serious news. It's because the culture, everybody knows about the lizard man down there in that area of South Carolina. It's that famous. Over the years, there's been the same kind of conjecture as to what it was. Some people claim it was a hoax. A farmer claimed that he scared this kid. But this farmer must have been very busy for the next 3 years, because he would have had to run across the road, run across a small runway in front of a crop duster. He would have had to jump out and traipse through skateboard swamp. So I'm not buying that. Bear with mange, that's come up. I get a lot of people send me the picture of that bear with mange on Facebook. It's a creepy looking thing, and if you saw that in the woods, it certainly would be totally strange looking. But I don't think that's what we're talking about, because this thing was described as running on 2 legs as well as a human can. It gets really crazy because some people believe there's a subterranean race of reptilians, reptoids, living under the earth, within the Earth's core. And that this creature was one of those. Perhaps it came up out of a cave and it was running through skateboard swamp. So you have a lot of, crazier theories when you start getting into reptilians, because of its connection with sort of the extraterrestrial type descriptions. Evolved dinosaurs. There are some theories about the dinosauroid, which if certain types of dinosaurs had survived, that over the years, the evolution would have caused them to stand upright. As their brains became larger, as they became smarter, they may end up walking upright like us. Now, of course, this, that would require a population of these creatures down there, and you just don't get that many sightings, so I'm not sure about that. I like to explain one cryptid with another cryptid. How about an algae-covered Bigfoot? That thing comes out, it's kind of the swamp thing kind of thing, So, it sounds crazy, but, in a way, like I said, Bigfoot is something that's a little more plausible. So you can almost see, if there was a Bigfoot living in the swampy environment, that might explain sightings of what the locals were calling the lizard man. There, as I said, I like to go to these locations. When I wrote my book, The Lizard Man, this was my follow-up to The Beast of Boggy Creek, which was, the book was selling well, so that's when I, like I said, I just wrote that book because I wanted to, but I thought, okay, this is going well, I'm on TV, the book is selling well, what do I do now? Well, I did what any other rational person would do. I went on what I call the swamp tour. which was thousands of miles driving all over the southern U.S. going to swamps that had sightings of creatures like this. And one of those was Skateboard Swamp, where the Bishopville lizard man was reported. And I actually wasn't even going to write a book about this. But again, when I got there, I started interviewing the sheriff, and I was interviewing one of the historians at the library, and the little newspaper came down there, was interviewing me and all this. And then a few weeks later, when I got back, they sent me a copy of the newspaper. It says, "Writer plans to write a book on the Bishopville lizard." I kid you not. I'm like, well, I guess I'm writing a book on the lizard man. And so that's how the book came about. But it was a fun book. And this is actually a shot of Skateboard Swamp, where one of the famous sightings had taken place, not far from where Christopher Davis had been attacked in his car by the creature. We talked about the surviving dinosaur thing. That's another really interesting thing. And when I was a kid, I loved dinosaurs. Read all the books, and just to imagine that there was any kind of surviving dinosaur, really clicked in my imagination. And in fact, there have been sightings of creatures that could be described as pterosaurs. You've got something called Kangamato, which translates to the breaker of boats. It's rumored to live in the swamps of western Zambia, Angola, and Congo, in the African regions. Their sightings date back to the 1930s and the 1950s of explorers over there who had seen this giant pterodactyl-like creature fly over. And the locals gave it the name Kangamato. Now these are, obviously remote. When you're talking about the swamps of Zambia, I mean, that sounds remote to me. This is Africa. Anything could go over there. And so there was a lot of credible reports and a lot of credibility to the fact that there could be some kind of bird over there that appeared to be a relic dinosaur. Now, flying reptiles went extinct over 66 million years ago. So this would require survival for a long period of time being unknown. But again, nothing's impossible. In the United States, you also have a number of sightings of these creatures, these leathery, winged creatures. And particularly in Texas and Oklahoma, you have a lot of sightings. And for whatever reason, Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, I've also seen a trend of these sightings. Recently, my colleague King Gerhardt and I went to Oklahoma and interviewed two sets of witnesses, two persons in each case, who literally told us they had seen a creature fitting this description fly either over their car or near their home. Neither of these people knew each other. And these occurred in a very close proximity in a time period. Neither of these people knew each other. And we had two witnesses corroborating this in both cases. I don't know how to explain that. They know the difference between a stork and a bat, and one of them was a daytime sighting, and one of them was in the full headlights of the car. So you have these reports of creatures that you just simply can't explain. We went to the woods there and looked around. Of course, you can't just go and see a cryptid upon command, but we thought it was super interesting that you kind of could corroborate the stories between these two witnesses. And they both, like it came out of a movie, they both told us, yeah, it's over in this Stinchcombe Wildlife Management Area. That's where we think they are staying or have stopped by. Again, they didn't know each other. So you often have these credible reports of very improbable creatures. One of my favorites is Mothman Bimbe. Has anybody heard of this one? Okay, good. This is a smart crowd. I see a lot of hands raised. So, when I was a kid, if I'd have known there was a real-life dinosaur in the Congo, that would have just freaked me out, But that's what people have reported. A 20 to 30-foot long creature resembling a brontosaurus in the Congo River Basin of Africa. And the locals over there, I don't have the name, it's called Mothman Bimbe, one who stops the flow of rivers. Obviously, brontosaurus, I suppose you would qualify for that position. It would be huge. In 1932, cryptozoologist Ivan T. Sanderson sighted a creature fitting this description. You got sightings in 1987. You've got many explorers who had gone over there to look for this creature because the natives had told about it for many, many years. And when you showed the natives a picture of every sort of animal, like a hippo, is this it? Nope. You know, you just run through all the known creatures. Suddenly you get to something like this, a brontosaurus, and they're doing this. So conceivably, what you have is the locals are aware of this creature. It's just that the Westerners are not. So that's been one of the intriguing things. Now, the possibility of a brontosaurus living over there in the swamps, it's not impossible. But, you know, this is a much larger creature. If you have even a small population of these, it would conceivably be easier to find. So, you know, obviously some of the theories are that it was a hippo or it was some normal animal or that people were seeing things. Now, the problem with this is it's hard to investigate something like this, not because the swamps are dangerous, and they are, the natives are dangerous, but that the government over there is so corrupt. What scares me, I've read several books by some of my colleagues who have gone over there, the scariest part about it is these guerrillas and these corrupt government officials coming up to them demanding money, taking their supplies. I mean, you're at the mercy of that corrupt government. So you can't just really go in there and say, hey, we're going to look for this dinosaur. Is that cool? No, we want your money. So I just would never go over there for those facts. I'm not afraid of swamps or dinosaurs. The corrupt governments. Yeah. So that's become a problem with this. So that this mystery kind of lingers on unsolved with Lochilia verbatim. Not all cryptids are fabulous creatures. Some can be creatures who are thought to be extinct. And that's the case of the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger. This is sort of a tragic story. It's a marsupial, lived in Tasmania and Australia. This is a real animal. And these are actual pictures of the creature here. It's a really cool looking marsupial, kind of related to the Tasmanian devil in a way, but bigger. Unfortunately, the creature was eradicated in the early 1900s. They had a bounty on its head because the farmers there thought it was destroying their livestock, eating the sheep, when it was in fact actually not. They just believed it was. So they put a bounty on its head and they said, get rid of them. And if you brought in a carcass or a hide, you were paid a bounty for that. And so it wasn't long before they eradicated these down to very small numbers. There was a few left in zoos, and finally on September 7th, 1936, the last thylacine died at the Hobart Zoo and officially was thought to have gone extinct. Now, over the years, though, there's been sightings down there in Tasmania and Australia, which suggests that perhaps some of these animals survived. Maybe a small population lived out on the outskirts and weren't eradicated and still lives. You've got sightings, you know, you can look back in the 1970s, there were sightings, 1980s, even today there's been several reported. And you've got some guys down there who pretty much have made it their thing. That's what they do. They're out there in the bush day by day, week by week, trying to find evidence of thylacines. There's been a few video footage captured that look like thylacines. There's been a few photos. Maybe kind of like a Bigfoot. I mean, we know this animal existed, though. That's the difference. And so these sightings suggest that maybe they're not. Science has actually been considering trying to revive it in some way, because we do have a sample. It's a full fetus of one of these thylacines, and so you know, that's kind of a touchy subject, but it's possible that they could resurrect it in some way, plant the DNA, or you know, bring it back. And I think in a lot of ways that's because with our modern mindset we feel guilty about this. This is a very beautiful and cool animal that we eradicated, especially for no reason, because it was dogs that were actually killing the livestock, not the thylacines, as we've since discovered. So this would fall into cryptozoology, and obviously, you know, scientists and other people would find this valuable work. You know, most consider the thylacine to be extinct for sure, but you know, there is that hope that it's still out there, and there's some great books on this as well. And there's a movie called The Hunter with Willem Dafoe. If you've ever seen that, it's a cool movie about the